you very much, Mr. Sampath. What a great opportunity that you have given me to speak at this group, very distinguished people, including my friend Jabamale. We served together in Vienna. I have had a very deep involvement in the United Nations. 20 years out of these 75 years, I was in different missions of India to the UN, all the 4 headquarters. So I have a perspective about the United Nations at the time of the 75th year. It is most unfortunate that the 75th year of United Nations fell in 2020, because 2020 is going to be known in history as the annus horribilis, the horrible year. We would like to erase it from history. Unfortunately, it is at the same time that we are celebrating the United Nations 75th anniversary. And that's a great disadvantage, because United Nations faced its ultimate challenge in March this year when the pandemic hit us. Most unfortunately, it happened to be the month in which the president of the Security Council was China. As a result of which, the United Nations failed to take any global action to meet this threat of the pandemic. And that has highlighted the many deficiencies of the UN and the many weaknesses and failures. It has, in fact, taken away from the UN the glamour that it had assumed in various parts of the world and the problems it has solved. Why did this happen? The fact that the United Nations has Security Council has 5 permanent members and they have a veto is a problem that has been raised many times. But it was demonstrated in its most unfortunate style at this time, because the Security Council was not even permitted to hold a meeting to consider the pandemic. And this has absolutely taken away whatever UN has done in the past. As far as India is concerned, we have looked at the United Nations not to seek anything from them, but to give our experience and also to deal with problems in a multidisciplinary way. And this started suffering. The multilateralism started suffering with the advent of President Trump. And President Trump has, in fact, walked away from the architecture of the United Nations, which was set up by the United States itself. So he has brought this theory that all of us are independent, sovereign nations, must act on their own. Each country must act for itself. That had created the kind of decline that we have seen in the United Nations. Members of the UN look at the United Nations differently. The 5 permanent members use the United Nations as an instrument of their policy. The lower countries, or the less developed countries, look at the United Nations to get whatever they can in terms of assistance, in terms of projects, etc. The smallest of the countries with 5,000 population or 10,000 population, they look at the United Nations as a way of identifying their sovereignty. But India has not seen it from any of these perspectives. All that we did in the UN right from the beginning were meant for the globe as a whole. Whether it was Pandit Nehru in 1948 or Mr. Narendra Modi this year, they pointed out the fact that India is struggling for its own place in the world. At the same time, all our ambitions and all our dreams are also the dreams of the world. This has been our approach to the United Nations. So I have seen a lot of accomplishments, I have seen failures, but one thing has remained certain, that India's commitment to the United Nations has remained all these years. India is one of the largest peacekeeping force contributing country. India has contributed the best of the UN resolutions, whatever the seminal resolutions by the United Nations, whether it is Security Council or General Assembly, India has been behind it. So India's contribution is very significant. Of course, Mr. Paneerselvam talked about the membership of the Security Council, permanent membership of the Security Council. But as he himself hinted, this is not going to happen ever. because the United Nations, for it to change the permanent members or add permanent members, you need a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly and 5 permanent members of the Security Council. We are blaming the Security Council permanent members for not supporting us, or some of them are not supporting us. But the real problem is not that. You need 2/3 majority of the General Assembly to move this resolution. And we unfortunately do not have it. Because the vast majority of the United Nations would not like another country to have veto. It is not India specific. They have nothing against India. But the general principle adopted by about, shall we say, about 70% or 80% of the members of the General Assembly is that, if possible, we should throw the permanent members out and veto out rather than add more new permanent members to that. So we should not bank on that. So 2 points that the Prime Minister raised on the occasion of the 75th anniversary belong to these 2 issues that I just mentioned. He asked this question as to where was the United Nations when in the last 7 to 8 months we were struggling with this pandemic. This is how he asked. This has an importance because in the past, when there were pandemics of this kind, in fact, less serious than this, like Ebola, HIV, AIDS, SARS, etc., the United Nations Security Council took on these issues without leaving it to the WHO, because these are issues not of health alone. This particular pandemic is existential. We do not even know what the demography of the world would be after this pandemic is over. So it is a matter of international peace and security. And the Security Council failed to handle it in that manner, unlike in the previous cases, simply because China is in the dock of either having created the pandemic or at least not letting the world know about it. And therefore, using their opportunity as a member of the Security Council, as the president of the Security Council for March 2020, they did a great disservice to the United Nations. Talking about reform. Reform is very cyclical. It keeps on happening. It is not the same United Nations today as it was in 1945. It was set up in order to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It has not succeeded. Yes, as it was mentioned, there was no Third World War and that could be attributed to the UN. But 800 wars were fought in these 75 years, which United Nations could not prevent. But the fact that there was a forum for all these countries to discuss these differences, through preventive diplomacy, through peacekeeping, through peace building, through peace reconstruction, the United Nations has saved several countries from disasters. And one of the greatest achievements of the UN, when Ban Ki-moon was asked on the 70th anniversary, what is the greatest achievement of the UN? He did not say we stopped the Third World War. He did not say that we made peace. He said United Nations has inoculated the world's children against infectious diseases and prevented so many million lives, much more than what could have been saved from these wars. So the United Nations, in spite of what I'm trying to say, is that in spite of all these deficiencies and difficulties and lack of progress and lack of reform, and not reflecting the world as it is today, it has made a tremendous contribution, particularly in terms of economic development, social development, setting standards for human rights, etc., etc. But today, this year, people are looking for an alternative to the UN because it has failed and it has been a disgrace. So the discussion that is taking place in the UN today, unfortunately not with everybody present there, they're also doing exactly what we are doing. And that also is a sad reflection of what the world is happening today. People are now looking for an alternative because we need a body, a decision-making body, which does not have the problem of the veto. And people are looking at G20, for example, as a decision-making body which would work outside the UN. But whatever this may happen, but I do not believe that there will be a complete collapse of the UN, because unlike the League of Nations, the UN has a utility much beyond the political or military utility. Because the specialized agencies, Mr. Jabamale talked about what he did in Sudan, and these are the kind of things which matter to the developing world, not these huge issues, etc. And therefore, the UN will continue. What reforms will be able to make in it, it is going to be limited. It will be more or less the same even after this is over. But the world after COVID has to change because of the tremendous change it has brought about. The economic collapse, the racial conflicts. So a huge number of issues are going to face the United Nations. And therefore, it has to acquire the kind of capability and capacity. And let us be realistic. We are not going to become a permanent member of the United Nations. But there are so many other ways. Why don't we strengthen the General Assembly? You generally shift the decision making from the Security Council to the General Assembly. That is possible if the majority of the member states want to do that. There is already a provision for what is called uniting for peace, which is if a particular resolution is vetoed by the Security Council, that resolution can be taken to the United Nations General Assembly under the provision of uniting for peace and pass it. But the difference is that while the Security Council decision is obligatory, mandatory to the members, the General Assembly decision is not. So here lies the issue. If we can find some way in which we are able to strengthen the General Assembly's ability to deal with issues, maybe may not be the same issues as the Security Council deals with, like peace and war, but on other issues, if the General Assembly can be strengthened and given the powers to deal with them decisively, and the members of the United Nations undertake to implement those resolutions rather than merely accept them as recommendations. So this is the kind of path we have to take, because we are not going to expand the Security Council under the provisions of the Charter, nor are we going to break up the United Nations and create a new one. But there is enough possibility within the UN Charter, though it's a small document, sounds very strong and unchangeable. Within that, we have been able to accept very many new ideas and issues. It has been a very resilient document. So that is where we have to look at. And that is the greatest hope that UN has. UN has succeeded in many issues. It has failed in many issues. On the whole, its balance is right. But unfortunately, this pandemic has given the UN a very bad name and the feeling that it is unable to cope to save mankind from extinction. And that is what we have to deal with. So in future, if such issues come, it should be possible for the United Nations to act without the cooperation of one or two countries which have veto power. And that is really where the test of the United Nations is going to be. And I hope in future, we will be able to work on that rather than keep talking about permanent membership of the Security Council. If it comes, well, it comes. But I do not believe that will ever happen that India will become a permanent member of the Security Council with veto. So the alternatives have to be found, and we have to work in terms of that. Thank you very much.